If you have a Bible, turn to 2 Kings chapter 6. 2 Kings chapter 6, or if you have an electronic device, turn there. We are in week 4 of a series, a 5-part series, so I'll conclude it next week. And one of the reasons why we teach in series at our church is because it allows us to take a topic that is a pretty in-depth topic and spread it out over many weeks so that we can go deeper and deeper and we can layer the truth. And the topic that we're looking at in this series is one that absolutely needed at least the 5 weeks that we're giving it. And what we've been exploring is the reality that all of us face challenges in our life. The phrase that we've been using just to kind of get us all on the same page is we're just calling it the it. Whatever the it is in your life, the challenge that you face. And the challenge can be relational, it could be financial, it could be health related, it could be a work situation, but all of us face the challenges of our life. And in the normal small challenges of life, I mean, that's just a reality. We handle it, we manage it. That's not really the issue. That's not even really what we're addressing. The fact of the matter, though, is that all of us at some point will face a challenge that is greater than us. And so where we began in this series is we said, you have to put the it in perspective, whatever it is. And part of that perspective is recognizing that some of the challenges you face, the it is greater than me, that it's greater than you. That all of your wisdom, all of your experiences, all of your resources might not be enough to change it. And so you have to recognize, I need help outside of myself in this situation. But for us who are in a relationship with God, the perspective doesn't just stop there so that we're just overwhelmed. Yeah, life is tough and there's nothing we can do about it. No, there's another layer to it, and this is where we continue to say, but you have to also recognize that God is greater than it. So the series of what we're looking at is God is greater than the it that's greater than me. And so we've been looking at this truth. So God is greater than it. God, who created all, has power to change any situation that he wants to. And so that was week 1. In week 2, we said, okay, but then let's examine this. If God is greater than the situation I'm facing, why is it that God doesn't always change that situation? Is it, from our perspective, if we say God is greater, does that mean that no matter what I ask, God just has to say yes and has to fix the situation? And what we recognize is that's not what God promised. God has made many promises to us in Scripture, but the one that we really held on to and looked at and examined is that God promised to change us to be more like Jesus Christ. And so in that promise, there's still going to be pain. There's going to be discomfort, because when you go from thinking one way to having your mind change, when you go from acting one way to having your behavior change, it's a difficult and painful process. And so we were saying, this is what God promised, though. This side of eternity, he's going to transform us to be more and more like Jesus. And then last week, we looked at this sobering truth that brings comfort, but it also is one that we just have to recognize, is that sometimes when we go to God and we ask him for specific things, God has to say no. And what we looked at is that God says no to some things so that he can say yes to something greater. And so those were I just kind of did a quick review. You probably know this. The further you get into a series, to try to review everything in depth just takes too long. So if you by chance missed any of those teachings, you can engage them all for free on our app or online on our YouTube page. But that's really the foundation of what we've looked at over the last 3 weeks. And one of the things I'm thankful for is that this series has already had a positive impact in people's lives. Whenever I'm creating a teaching, I often think about the target audience, who it is that I want this truth to resonate with. And I'll think about from the most simple of situations to the most complex of situations. And one of the things I'm thankful for is people who are really going through difficult seasons have come up to me and shared how this series is impacting them. And I'm talking about people who have lost loved ones in this season, spouses in this season. And one of the reasons why it is bringing such peace to people is because the information we're looking at really is changing people's perspectives. People are understanding, some of them maybe for the first time or maybe in a more complete way, they're understanding that God really is bigger than the challenges of their life. They're realizing more in depth than they ever have that God truly does love them. We've just kind of saturated this series with that truth. God really does love you. But then we've also looked at the idea that what can seem out of control really isn't, that God has a plan for your life. And it's so important for us to understand the power of perspective, because I'll say it this way, how we view things, it impacts every element of our life. Our perspective, how we think, how we view things, very much impacts how we feel. Is that fair to say? I mean, you think about it, if you wake up in the morning and you have a positive outlook on the day, like today is going to be a great day, that's your perspective, then how are you going to feel all day? You're going to feel energized and have joy, and you're going to have optimism in your life, and then your behavior is going to follow that feeling. So your perspective is going to shape how you feel. It's going to shape how you act. And obviously we can flip that around and go to the negative. If you wake up thinking, today is going to be an awful day, well, most likely you're going to feel that anxiety, that stress, maybe even that depression, and then you're going to act accordingly. Perspective shapes how we think and how we feel. And so what I want to do today, as we just go a little bit deeper, is I want to help us to understand there's a missing piece that we oftentimes lose sight of in our perspective. And the reason why this is so important is because of this truth. If you don't have all the information, or the information you have isn't correct, you will form a perspective that will lead you the wrong way. So I want to say it one more time. If you don't have all of the information needed, or the information you have is not fully correct or it's incorrect, it's going to cause you to form a perspective that could lead you the wrong way. I'll give you a few just kind of somewhat humorous examples. One time, I might have shared this before in the past, I went to this conference in Texas at a large church, and in one of the breakout sessions, one of their elders was speaking. He was talking about elder governance of churches and stuff. It was really fascinating. And so afterwards, I went up just to talk to him, and there was a few other people that were there, so I was kind of waited in line. And while this guy is answering questions, this young lady, like well-dressed, obviously his assistant, walks up and she has a coffee for him, and she gives him the coffee. And this guy, who's probably in his mid-50s, late 50s, he just basically starts making eyes with this girl. And I'm in line, and I'm totally noticing, I'm like, what's going on? Like, he's like, he winks at her, and I'm like, this guy, you guys know what I'm talking about? Like, this dude is flirting, like, in front of all of us. And I'm thinking, like, we see you, dude. Like, if you can see me, I can see you. And then he goes, everyone, this is my assistant. I'm like, yeah, we know. And he goes, who's also my daughter. Yeah, and I was like, I am an unrighteous man. Like, felt so bad. Such arrogance in my own heart, right, in that moment. But I was like, I did not have all the information needed, right? I formed an opinion, an incorrect opinion, right? Like, what happens? Here's another example of that. So a few years ago now, probably 8 years ago now, maybe less, I don't know, I had knee problems. And so much so that I had to go have surgery on it. But I was having really bad, intense pain in my knee. And so I had to get an MRI. I went to the specialist. So I did this MRI. And then I went to see this specialist, this doctor. And so I'm in his room. I've never met this doctor before. I'm just in the waiting room, like actually in the room he's going to come into. I know that he's out in the hallway looking at the results of the MRI and all that. And he walks into the room, and this is literally the first time I've ever met him. He opens the door, walks in, and goes, oh, whoa, I wasn't expecting to see you. And I was like, what does that mean? He goes, well, normally people who have an MRI like that are in their late 50s or 60s. And I was like, oh. Like, I mean, I went from a little bit of, it was a lot of pain, but like in my mind thinking like, we'll do a quick surgery, I'll be okay, to that. And I go, well, what does that mean? So he comes in and like, this is his first thing he says to me. So I go, what does that mean? Like, what's the long-term prognosis of what you just said? And he goes, well, total knee replacement. And I'm like, what? I mean, this is devastating news to me. I don't want to be like overly dramatic, but like my life flashed before my eyes. Like I was like, I'm not going to be able to play sports with my kids. My training's going to look different. Like, I mean, my whole life I've loved sport. I was like, my mind was reeling. I was like, oh man. I mean, I physically got hot. Like I was like almost dizzy. And I was like, oh. And I go, so I have to have a knee replacement? He goes, well, not now, like when you're 60. And I was like, oh, dude, I'm going to choke you out. Like, lead with that next time, right? Again, partial information, but it just impacted my emotions and how I felt. I'll tell you one other example. This one's a little bit more negative. Years ago, I had a person in our church tell me information. This person, at one point, I won't tell you who they are. You don't need to know, okay? But this person told me information. I don't go to our church anymore. This person told me information about someone else in our church that was really negative. They said, I just want you to know, and they said, you should know this, and it was a super negative story. And I was like, okay, that's not my experience with that person. So in the past, I've never had anything negative with this person. And so from that moment on, I always just had in the back of my mind that this person was negative. And yet, every single encounter that I or any of my staff had with this person was always positive. Always. Like, nothing at all negative. And it was like 8 years later, it felt like, where I was like, oh, the person who initially told me was lying. But all that, anyone ever have that happen to you? Someone just gives you like gossip or something? And I realized, and I never mistreated this person, like it was always like, it was just always confusing to me. I don't see the negative in it. You know why? There wasn't negative. I had misinformation. And misinformation shaped to some degree how I was thinking, how I was feeling. And I think you get it. You get the point of what I'm stressing. The information, if we don't have all of it, if we don't have correct information, it impacts how we think and how we feel. And the reason why this is so important is one of the reasons why life can be overwhelming, and one of the reasons why life can hurt is because we don't have all of the information. This is my experience, and maybe it's not yours, but my experience is when we get negative information, many times it stops us from taking in new information. When like if you go to the doctor, like I had that moment where the doctor tells me it's bad news, I have to have total knee replacement surgery. In that moment, it was like everything was reeling. All I could think about was, this now is my new reality. And the same thing can happen to you. You go to a doctor and they give you a true, accurate, negative health report, and that can become the filter through which you view life. And all other information kind of gets pushed aside. If your spouse comes to you and says, I want a divorce, all of a sudden that changes your reality. All of a sudden, that's the new filter that you're viewing everything. You're viewing your past through that. You're viewing your present through that. You're viewing your future through that. You're viewing financial decisions through that, relational decisions through that. It becomes the filter. And you can say this truth over anything that's really negative. So there are times in our lives that the it that we're facing becomes this filter, and it's stopping us from taking in all the information that's necessary to truly form an accurate perspective of life. And so here's what I want to do today is I want to challenge us that when we face a negative situation, when we face a difficult situation, the it is overwhelming, to ask ourselves two important questions. Here's the first. Do I have all the facts? We know we have at least one major fact, whatever it is that's threatening us, but do I have all the facts? And the second question is similar. Am I open to new information? Am I willing to receive new information? So let me say this. I just want to pause. If you're here and you're a Christian, then I'm going to share an information with you today that you should already know, but there's a chance you don't. But if you're here today and you're not a follower of God, maybe someone invited you to church or they nagged you until you finally came and you're here and you're just kind of curious. Maybe you don't even want to be here. Here's the same challenge I would give to you is, are you willing today for the possibility that there might be some information you don't know, some new information that can actually add some peace to your life in seasons of uncertainty? Because for all of us, what happens sometimes is that we just lean a certain way. And if you're a pessimist, then what you typically lean toward is the only information you receive is negative. And I think we've all been around people like that, where every single conversation, it's just, you're like, hey, how are you? And like, you don't even want to ask the question. You guys know what I'm talking about? Like, so sometimes you don't. You just walk up to them, hi, you. And then they just go, well, you know, life. And you're like, oh, here we go. Okay. You ever see that Saturday Night Live skit, Debbie Downer? Wah, wah, wah. You know, it feels like that a little bit. But, a pessimist takes in the negative, and they kind of exclude all of the positive. And that's obviously really unhealthy because that's limited information. But this will be shocking to you. Do you know the optimist can be just as unhealthy? The optimist can take in only the positive and ignore things that need to be addressed, some negative things that can be truly threats to your well-being. So both of those are extreme. But then there's another group that all of us can fall into at times, and that's just the biased person. You have a bias. We see this often in politics, honestly. If people lean toward a political party, a biased person only takes in the information that supports what they already believe. And in our lives, whether you're a pessimist, an optimist, just biased in some way, the moment you stop taking in new information, you're in a dangerous place. And so what I hope today is that for us as people and for those of us as Christians, that we'll have an openness today to say, okay, I want to take in all the proper information that God has revealed to us so that I can have the peace that He's promised. Because that's what we've looked at in this series. God has promised pain. It's a reality of a world broken by sin. But He's promised us peace in the midst of that pain. but you will never experience peace until you take in all the information that God has made available to you. So I want you to pause right now, and I want you to think about your perspective. I want you to think about what shapes your perspective, but I also want you to think about what limits your perspective. See, for all of us as people, there are 4 major things that both impact and limit our perspective. Here's the first. We're limited by time. We experience the now. We're not eternal beings. We don't operate outside of time. We are captivated by the urgent. We're captivated by the now. So your life can be heading one way, and then all of a sudden something negative or positive happens, and all of a sudden that just becomes your reality. Is that fair? I think the more mature we get, the better we get at taking a little bit of step back. But you think about children. Are children captivated by the now? Absolutely. I mean, I know with my kids, it was, I want what I want, and I want it now, and if you don't give it to me, I'm going to scream, right? And that was them until about 17 years old. I'm just kidding. None of my kids are even 17, so okay. Cole's in front. Isn't dad humor great? It's awesome, yeah. My kids often go, oh, Dad, that's a great dad joke. You know, and they say it with total sarcasm. Doesn't even slow me down. I just keep doing it. But, you know, we're captivated by now. So our perspective is limited by time. Whatever is going on now, that's what we're focused on. But it's also limited by space. We're in one place at a time. And what I mean by that is we have limited bandwidth, emotional bandwidth, mental bandwidth. We can only process what we're going through. We don't always have the ability to understand our story in the context of the bigger picture. I even had this last week. It was really a touching moment, but last week I was sharing my testimony about how I grew up in Detroit and planned on staying there my entire life, but God said no to Detroit to say yes to Lancaster, and I just kind of shared my testimony. I had multiple people come to me afterwards, and they said, you know, if you didn't come to Lancaster, I don't know where I would be, where I am in my faith, and like you've had such an impact. Again, it's so touching. It really touched my heart, I'll say it that way. But what I realized is I don't even at times fully understand my impact in other people's lives, whether positive or negative. And I'm not just talking about in the church, I'm just talking about in relationships. And I would say that's true for most of us. We're just limited by space. We don't understand the big picture. So we're limited by time, we're limited by space. But we're also limited by experience. What we experience and maybe what someone close to us has experienced, that shapes our reality. And so if we've had a life where there is a lot of reasons to be optimistic, then we'll probably lean toward optimism. If we've had a life of neglect or difficulties, we might lean toward pessimism. But our experience becomes our filter. How your parents viewed life and communicated that to you very much influences how you view life. So again, when we look at our perspectives, we're limited by time, we're limited by space, we're limited by experience. But do you know how else we're limited? We're limited by selfishness. Because we are just naturally interested in what makes us happy. I mean, think about it. How do we determine if an experience is good or bad? Whether or not it makes us happy. Our bad experience might be good for everybody else. We might have a sacrifice, it might be a negative, and it might bring added value to someone else's life, but we don't then view that situation as good. When you have to take one for the team, let's admit it, you're still taking one. You're still suffering. And so for us, naturally, I'm not even criticizing this, I'm just saying this is just simply a reality. We're selfish. We want to be happy. We want to have joy. We want to be comfortable. And so our motivation, limited by time, limited by space, limited by experience, limited by our own selfishness, this is how we view the world naturally, okay? So let's put that in perspective. That's who we are. Now let's pause and let's look at God's perspective. And these are things clearly communicated in Scripture. Here's one. God is eternal. This is one of those things, as a kid and as an adult, this is still hard for me to process. There are times when I'm laying in bed and I'm having a hard time falling asleep and I start thinking about this and I wish I wouldn't. The thought that God was not created. Just spend some time thinking about that. But how is that possible? Anyone have that? He's just always been. But do you know, it's deeper than just saying he's always been. God is the creator of the physical realm that we exist in. He's the creator of the universe. He's the creator of the concept of time. God operates outside of time. God fully, perfectly understands all things past, present, and future. And so God is an eternal being. On top of that, where we're limited by space, God is omnipresent. He is able to be anywhere and everywhere at all times and give every situation his undivided attention. On top of that, he's omniscient, which means he knows all things. He knows every single thing that's going on in every single situation. He knows every thought of man and woman. He knows every worry, every anxiety. Scripture even tells us he knows so much that he knows even the hairs on your head. He knows every little detail about every situation ever. Isn't that incredible to think about? That's his perspective. He's also omnipotent, which means he is all powerful. At any moment, God can do anything that he wants to do. But I also want to say one more thing about God's perspective. God has a redemption plan. I want you to hear this. Every single thing that God does in his interaction with humanity is for one purpose, the redemption of humanity, that more might come to be saved and enter into a relationship with God. You have to understand the weight of this. Even this week when I was just concluding my notes and I was in the room with all of our staff, I just said, guys, listen to this thought. This is something we all know, but I want to remind you again. Every interaction of God with humanity is for one purpose, to bring redemption to us. There is nothing that we can provide to God that he needs. He is perfectly self-sufficient and yet chooses to be engaged in humanity, and every single thing he does is to redeem people, that people might come to know him. God is, so he's all the omnis, all the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, but he is also omni-loving. He is perfectly loving. The Bible begins explaining humanity's failure. The Bible ends explaining the total redemption, where all things are brought into order with God, and everything in between in the scriptures and everything in between in our experience is all a part of the plan that's leading toward redemption. This is God's perspective. And the reason why I say all of that to shape where we're going today is because as Christians, we have to recognize there is stuff going on that we don't see, that we're not aware of. There is a physical and spiritual reality. And here's the truth I want you to fully embrace in your heart. God is always working in ways we don't see. We are so limited in our perspective, but God's promise is in every way he will be working. And I want you to understand this. We are physical beings. Everything we experience is in the physical. It's the only reality we know, but it's not the only reality there is. God is a spiritual being. There is a spiritual reality going on. And if you're not a person of faith, that can sound really silly, that can sound really weird. But really, the Western culture is the only culture that struggles with this. Every other culture doesn't. There is a spiritual reality. Jesus said it about God himself. He said that God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Paul tells us in the scriptures, he says, this is my paraphrase, what Paul actually says is he goes, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in the heavenly realms. He talks about the spiritual. But another way to word that is Paul says, the it that we wrestle with, the it that we face, it's not just physical. There is a spiritual reality going on. And right now, in all of our lives, God wants us to understand one of the missing pieces of information that we often forget or neglect is that even when we don't see God moving, he's still moving. Even when we don't see him working, he's still working, because this is his promise to us. And so I want to show you this in a powerful story in Scripture. So if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, turn to 2 Kings 6, and I want to show you this. This story, one of the main characters in this story, his name is Elisha. It was mentioned in one of the songs we sang today. Elisha was this incredible man of God. He was initially an apprentice to the prophet Elijah. And Elijah, again, another incredible man of God. God so anointed Elijah, he was able to do miraculous things. He was a spokesperson for God. But when God took Elijah up to heaven, he put a special anointing on Elisha, actually a double portion, so that Elisha would continue the ministry of Elijah. And this is a story of Elisha. So it says this. It says, and normally I'll give you some background information, but it's included in the story, so I'll explain it as we go. It says, once when the king of Syria was warring against Israel, he took counsel with his servants, saying, At such and such a place shall be my camp. But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are going down there. And the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God told him. Thus he used to warn him, so that he saved himself there more than once or twice. So it's kind of weirdly worded, but this is basically what it's saying. The king of Syria would just begin to raid the different cities of Israel and different areas to plunder it and to steal. But when he set out to do this, Elisha would receive a word from God, would warn the king of Israel, so the king of Israel would send commands so the people would be prepared and they wouldn't go to certain areas. And so the king of Syria was never successful, okay? Now I just want to pause. I love the way that's worded, and I'm going to make this a part of my own phraseology. It says, so that he saved him there more than once or twice. If I ever mess up now, like if someone were to say, like, did you forget to take the garbage to the road? I'm going to say, I've done that more than once or twice. It's like just such an easy way to word things, right? My wife's probably not super excited about that new plan of mine, but let's continue. So in verse 11 it says, And the mind of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing, and he called his servants and said to them, Will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel? So the king of Syria is like, obviously there has to be a spy, because none of our plans are working. And so he calls his people, who's the spy? And they respond. One of his servants said, None, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who was in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom, like the most private things, the most intimate place. Like he knows it all. And he said, Go and see where he, Elisha, is, that I may send and seize him. It was told him, Behold, he is in Dathan. So he goes, where is he? Like, we got to find him. In order to be successful, I need to kill Elisha, and then I can plunder Israel and I can be successful. Verse 14, so he, the king of Syria, sent there, Dathan, horses and chariots and a great army, and they came by night, so secretively, and surrounded the city. So let's just pause now. Dathan is a small city. It's about 12 miles from the capital of Samaria, where the king of Israel would have been. And so this is a small community, and the king of Syria surrounds it with his superior army of soldiers and chariots. So let's just do a mental exercise for a moment. I just told you information. Imagine that you're in Dathan. You're in this community, the city, and you wake up and you're surrounded by a superior army that has more men, better equipment. You're not prepared. You're just this little community. What does that information tell you? Would we all agree that at the bare minimum, it tells you you're about to surrender, right? I mean, that's the bare minimum. That's best case scenario. They're surrounded you. In that time, if an army surrounds you, it oftentimes, if not all the time, meant much worse than that. But you think best case is total surrender, that they're going to come in, take what they want. They might kill some men. They might take the women and do awful things. They might take them into slavery. They're going to take all of our possessions. But now we're going to have new rulers if they want to stay here. But most likely it will mean something worse. So that information says best case is surrender. Worst case is destruction. They're going to kill all of us. They're going to kill just the men. They're going to make people slaves. They're going to take all of our possessions. This is what information does. It just, like, you take it in, because what would you do if you were in Dathan? You would think about either your past experiences or someone else's past experiences. You would think about, well, the last time we were in a situation with a superior army, this is what happened. Or maybe you never experienced it, but I've heard the stories. I know when it happened to this city. I know when Syria did it to this community. And so information tells you the worst case scenario. Information tells you that bad is about to happen. So in verse 15, the story continues. When the servant of the man of God, so the servant of Elisha, like his apprentice, the person who helped him, when the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said, Alas, my master, what shall we do? So obviously from the language, the servant is freaking out, as he should. Would we agree that his response is logical? He looks up and goes, oh my goodness, this is what's going to happen. I don't know if he knew the details, but he could have suspected, oh, they're coming for you, Elisha, because what you mean to Israel, to the king of Israel, and their safety and their salvation. And so he looks and he goes, oh my goodness. And so he loses peace because he's properly reading the information that he has. And friends, this is exactly what happens to us. Negative information is reported to us, and we start to process it through our own experiences. We process it through other people's experiences. And we go, okay, this must be the end result. It's going to turn out, best case still means I'm going to lessen the quality of life. And so he's nervous, he goes to the master, he's freaking out, and then Elisha has a very unusual response. Elisha said, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And I don't know why, I've even shared this before when I've talked about this story. For some reason, I know this is theologically not accurate and historically not accurate, but I picture Elisha with a mug of coffee. That he walks out, and his servant's like, "Oh my goodness, look at all these and the mountains all around us, all these chariots, and they're going to destroy us." And he's like, "No. The people that are with us are greater than them. Like, we outnumber them." So if you're the servant of Elisha, you know he's a man of God, but in this moment you think, oh, he lost his mind. Because he's not reading the information correctly, right? Because the servant would hear Elisha and go, okay, I'm looking at this surrounding army, and I'm looking at this small community, and what he just said doesn't make sense. So what's the missing piece here? It's that Elisha has information that the servant doesn't. And in our lives, when we lose hope and we get stressed out, it's oftentimes because we're not taking in all the necessary information. So then Elisha prayed and said, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. What this man was then able to experience is the spiritual reality that God sends his angels, God sends his spirit to be a protective force in our lives. And in this moment, what God allowed the servant to see is actually the forces of heaven were protecting Elisha, and Elisha had no need to fear. And in our lives, we lose sight of this reality that because we don't physically see it, we lose sight of the reality that God is always working his ways for our betterment. And so the soldiers, they don't see the chariots of fire. They don't see the spiritual beings. So you know what they do? They come down to attack. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, "Please strike this people with blindness." So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. And I don't think from this context that it was blindness as in they couldn't see at all, as much as he just kind of made their minds dumb, like made them to not fully understand what was going on in this moment. Because they come down and they think they're going to be successful. There's Elisha. I mean, can you imagine them? Someone goes, "There he is. There's a man of God." And they go, "Attack." And they start coming down. And on the way down, all of a sudden, there's confusion. And I'm just going to read this quickly for time's sake. And Elisha said to them, so they come down to attack, and they stop, and they slow down. He says, "This is not the way, and this is not the city." Now, you can't read that without thinking Star Wars, right? This is not the city. This is not the way. If you've never seen it, where have you been, okay? But he says, "This is not the way, this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek." And he led them to Samaria. Samaria is the capital city where the army of Israel actually was. And so he leads this opposing army in their blindness to the city where now they're going to be vulnerable. As soon as they entered Samaria, Elisha said, "O Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see." So the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. So what's not said, but what's assumed is they're now surrounded by the armies of Israel. So they went from a position of strength to of weakness. And as soon as the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, "My father, shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down?" This dude's fired up. "Should I kill them? Should I kill our enemies?" And Elisha answered, "You shall not strike them down. Would you strike down those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master." So he prepared for them a great feast, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. And the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel. The situation that was about to be war, about to be destruction, ends without any loss of life. and all the future battles were done away with because Elisha embraced a different reality. He included the spiritual with the physical. And this is what we can't lose sight of in our life. That God is working in times of difficulty, in times that don't make sense to us, that God's still moving. This week I sent out an email to my staff and I was like, can you just share with me some of the stories of that truth so that I can share them with the church? And many of them sent them to me. And I just want to share a few with you. Some of you know these. Nate and Tiffany Falk, many years ago, when they got married, they wanted to have children, but they were unable to because of Nate's childhood cancer. So they were unable to have children. And they were hoping for a miracle. They were hoping that God would do a miracle physically and make this happen, but that wasn't God's plan. And so in that season, as they were so frustrated, so hurt and devastated, still believing in God, but just feeling the up and down of the emotional struggle of that season, what they didn't realize is that God had the perfect child for them. And if any of you know their son, that dude is perfect for them. He is, first of all, he looks like them, but he acts like them. And the reality of it was that God was working this beautiful situation that their son, his new reality as he was born and immediately adopted into their family, his reality is he'll never experience anything but two loving parents raising him in a godly home. That God knew, even though they didn't understand it, that God was working this bigger plan for this child to be connected into their family. And at the same similar time, and again, all these stories I share with permission, Jamie and Corey Kilbarger in our church were going through a very similar situation. Unable to have children, the devastation of that, multiple miscarriages, and just the pain that it just causes someone. And why did God allow that? Well, there was another child that God knew he wanted to be raised in a different family, in a different situation. And so they were able to adopt that child. And in the moment that they adopted that child, within like a month or two, guess what? She became pregnant. And so she had two sons now at that almost identical age. That many people, when they see them, think they're twins. And they've gone on and just recently had another child. But God, in that one season, was saying no because he knew he had a greater plan for the child that would be raised in a loving home with godly parents. God says no at times so you can say yes to something greater. God is working when we don't even see it. And Pastor Brandon sent me a story of him and his wife, Megan. Megan was in a school system and was teaching, and then that school system just suddenly had a cut in workforce, and they laid off people, and it was just by seniority, and she was just the lowest one on there. And so all of a sudden, she just couldn't understand it. She lost her job. They just had their first child, and so obviously you don't want to lose a job, this like devastating moment. But what Megan didn't realize was going on is that her alma mater, that her place that she always wanted to teach, Fairfield Union, that they would all of a sudden have 3 openings in the field that she studied and had her degree, and she was able to go and get her dream job, which she still is employed to today. That in the moment, though, of the pain, you think, God, what are you doing? You know, why would we have a child and then all of a sudden lose our job? And God goes, it's okay. I'm working. And it opens up something different. And Brandon said, my story was for years I had jobs that I didn't fully understand. He had enjoyment in them, but there'd be moments that was really difficult, that he was learning new skill sets and he was learning new ways to think, and it was challenging his perspective, and he was able to grow in faith. And he had no idea through all these years of unfulfilling jobs that God had a bigger plan. And the bigger plan would be that one day he would get a phone call from me, and I would say, will you come in and interview for a job? And he became one of our pastors over discipleship now at our church. God knew when Brandon was going through this job and this job and this job, God knew what he was doing. He was molding and shaping his personality and his character and his skill set because he knew in the future Brandon would be a part of his plan for the advancement of the kingdom in this community. And in all of our lives, I could go through and just give story after story. And even as I was thinking about the assembling of our staff here at the church, how many of them came from different communities. Stacy's here because she fell in love with Ben. Stacy was from a different part. And Brandon, his wife came, and because of his wife came Cassie, and because of Cassie came Chris, because Chris fell in love with Cassie, and from a different community. And I think about Katie Iser. Is she in here? Yeah, Katie Iser and Josh. They were part of our Connect group, and so we built that relationship. And then she was my insurance agent, helping me for years. I knew how dynamic she was. And so when the position opened, it was just all the different things that God does in relationships and connections to bring people together. Another story I want to share is, a couple of years ago, we had some transition in our youth ministry department, and so I asked Kenny, who's now over our production, I asked Kenny, will you be the youth guy? And he said, yeah, I'll do it. I'll step out in faith, and I'll try that. And he did it for a year, did a great job with it. But one of the things Kenny realized, it wasn't his calling. It wasn't his skill set. And so it started to drain him. So instead of being fulfilling to him week after week, it was draining him. But if you know Kenny, such a tender-hearted guy, super, super loyal, and even loyal to me. And so Kenny knew, I can't do this job, but I don't want to let Matt down. So you know what Kenny did? He literally marked on his calendar the day that he had to tell me the news. It took him a few weeks to kind of build up the energy for it. So he just marked on the calendar. On this specific day, I'm going to go into Matt's office. I'm going to let him know that I can't do this job in youth ministry. Okay. So while that's going on, Kenny has no idea anything else is going on. We bring in this other guy that we want to interview at that time for a creative position to oversee the creative ministry in our church. That guy's name is Mackie McAdams. And so Mackie comes in, and we're interviewing him for the creative job. And it's that day. Kenny has no idea that's going on. But before I even meet with Mackie, Kenny comes into my office and says, hey, I need to resign this position. I said, okay, that's interesting. So Kenny goes out, and I sit down with Mackie, and I said, Mackie, I know we brought you in, and Mackie's experience is in youth ministry too, mainly in youth ministry. I said, Mackie, I got an interesting question. I know we brought you here to talk about creative, but would you be interested in doing youth ministry? And he goes, this is literally said, he goes, this job just got way more interesting to me. And so we hired him as a youth pastor. And Mackie, for you that don't know, has led our youth ministry. It's over tripled in size in the last couple of years. Just phenomenal youth pastor. And with Kenny, so Kenny thought when he came into my office, when he resigned, he thought he was resigning from staff. And we actually prepared for that. We were going to have a going away party for him. But I was devastated because I was like, oh, Kenny just adds such value to our community. So at the same time, God was stirring my heart to move Pastor Chris from production into discipleship. Everything about Chris screams discipleship. Christian education, encouraging people, that's where his passion was. So I called Chris and I said, Chris, would you want to go to this? And he was like, yes. Don't even finish the sentence. Yes, I'm all in. That's what I want to do. Chris goes that, opens a position for Kenny to stay here. And now Kenny is over our production. And even this past week, when talking with Kenny, he says, you know what I love to do? I love to read manuals. Can we all agree? God had a position for Kenny, right? Technology and production, that's what he oversees at our church. Okay. But I could tell you story after story of the shut doors that became open ministry opportunities, the pains of our life that shaped us so that we could be more sensitive to someone else that would go through a same situation. What we have to remind ourselves of is we have an all-powerful God, loving God who has a redemptive plan, who has promised to work all things out for good. And so even though we don't see him moving, that's not all the information. That's a piece of the information. We have to, in faith, believe he's working. He's moving. He's doing something because he's a good God who keeps his word. So here's what I want to end with for all of you. The two questions I asked earlier. If you're going through a difficult situation, ask yourselves this question. Do you have all the facts? Now, you know the fact you have, the challenge you're facing, but do you have all the facts? Do you know what God is doing? And I think you'll have to say, well, I don't know for sure. Then I'll say, then in peace and in faith, trust him. Are you open to taking in new information? Then in faith, trust that the God who has promised to work things out for good is working on your behalf.